Wonderful. It's been said that the GI Bill was one of the major resources used by veterans to gain access to higher education because they could attend for free, no tuition, and this was after World War II, and that they could buy a home without a down payment. However, there were many people of color who were not allowed through discrimination to live in certain neighborhoods or have access to those benefits because of segregation in America. And that generational loss of the home by the great-grandparents of African Americans and Latinos now we could see that in the level of homelessness, if you want to put it that way, of people today, young people today, because those young people who are not people of color are people who can inherit the home of the great-grandfather or the grandfather, and that wealth gives them a basis to begin life that people of color will not have. So as we study the history of discrimination, that was pointed out by Dr. Shapiro, and we're looking at, with Dr. Hamilton, how the economics of it all play out. How do we look at the problem? How do we divide up the groups? And your work has been on, in order for us to study the problem, we have to know exactly what we're looking at. So if you would go forward, Dr. Hamilton, and tell us more from the economic perspective, how you see the problem and the solution.
I'll take this. All right. So thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today. As was mentioned, my primary task is to talk about some characteristics of groups and inequality and report on some findings of a report that was jointly produced. But I'm also going to talk about a policy that I dare say could dramatically close, if not come close to eliminating the racial wealth gap in 2 to 3 generations, and something that we can do, that it's affordable and within our choice set and feasibility to enact. All right, but even before I even start, I also want to mention that the title of this panel is The War on Poverty, but Michael Sheridan had the vision to change that discussion to bring in the concept of asset and asset poverty in the early 1990s, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also grateful for the pioneering work that took place by my fellow panelists, Tom Shapiro, along with Melvin Oliver, that talked about black-white wealth inequality as being a true source of inequality that took the conversation beyond income. All right. So wealth is the single best determinant of economic opportunity, economic security, and overall well-being. Yet there's no other economic indicator in which whites and communities of colors are more disparate. The main source of this disparity is inheritance, in vivo transfers, or some other access to capital to provide seed money to purchase a wealth-generating asset to build economic security over a lifetime. So it is that initial seed money, a down payment to start a business, to purchase a home at an early point in one's life that people generally get from an inheritance or some other transfer that allows them to build economic security over their lifetime. I'm going to talk a little bit about data of the latest round of the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which was a data set done by the Census, and then data from the National Asset Scorecard in Communities of Color Project, contained in a report co-authored by Rebecca Tippett, Avis Jones DeWeaver, Maya Rockymore, William Darrick, and myself. The study demonstrates that the dismal asset position for many communities of color prior to the Great Recession got even worse after the recession, right? So we analyzed a round of SIP that looks at progress through this gradual recovery. So our analysis of the 2011 Survey of Income and Program Participation data reveals that in a recovery period following the Great Recession, the average Black and Latino families still own a little more than a nickel, 6 and 7 cents respectively, for every dollar in wealth held by the typical white family. The absolute wealth gap exceeds $100,000. This represents a recovery of a meager 1 penny. So it's 1 penny more than what was reported by Tom Shapiro, when Black and Latinos originally had about 5 and 6 cents respectively for every dollar in white wealth. In terms of liquid assets, Black and Latino families are nearly penniless. When it comes to access to immediate cash, which leaves them particularly vulnerable to financial emergencies or shocks. Liquid assets are those that can readily be converted to cash. The typical black family has $200, while the typical Latino family has $340 in liquid assets, which is a small fraction of the $23,000 in liquid assets that the typical white family has. If we remove retirement savings from that liquid asset figure that I quoted, the typical black family would have $25, and the typical Latino family would have $100 reserved in liquid assets. Now, we know that that'd be not barely enough to cover cab rides if you're going back to the airport today. Americans, regardless of race, suffered from the housing crisis, but communities of color suffered the most. Between 2005 and 2009, the median black, Latino, and Asian family each lost over half of their wealth. In comparison, the median white family lost about 14% of their wealth. The study that I'm talking about today documents what happened between 2009 and 2011 as well, as the economy began to gradually recover. Communities of color have made marginal relative gains, but are still nowhere near their wealth position before the crises. Since 2005, the median wealth loss for black and Latino families is 43% and 56% respectively. But the story is not in the actual percentages. The story is in whatever meager wealth they had before the recession was lost and is still far from return. Since 2005, the median white family lost about 19% of their wealth. The median Asian family lost 46% of their wealth and suffered the largest absolute loss of all the groups. Since the recession, a typical Asian family lost $78,000 in wealth. This was largely due to their geographical position. Areas in which Asian families resided benefited the most from the housing boom and likewise suffered the most from the housing bust. But this is not the complete story. As America continues to become more plural, the lack of economic security for many communities of color remain entirely undocumented. For example, the aggregate categories like Asian mask the asset position for certain groups like those immigrating from Southeast Asia, like Vietnamese Americans, groups whose economic positions are typically lower than their Asian peers. Or worse, insecure economic positions of indigenous groups, like Native Americans, is often hidden altogether in the nebulous category that we call other. New data from a pilot study allows us to examine more precisely defined ethnic groups. Led by William Darrick and myself, and with the generous support of the Ford Foundation, the National Asset Scorecard and Communities of Color Project assembled a talented multidisciplinary team with expertise in wealth and ethnic studies, as well as many other disciplinary trainings, to shed light on these omissions. We used a systematic approach to ascertain geographical and demographic representation of some ethnic and racial subpopulations whose asset and debt positions we previously knew little. We designed and implemented a pilot survey in 4 targeted metropolitan areas: Los Angeles, Miami, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Washington, D.C., to examine the asset and debt positions of these groups. And with additional support from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, we added a 5th city, Boston. All right. So I'm happy to talk more about the methodology in the question and answer section. I can't understate this part. Many people on our team are here today, so this is a collaborative effort. And there are also individuals and organizations in this room which have greatly influenced this project. A project directory of the entire research team will be forthcoming as we roll out additional data from the study. No project has unlimited resources, but in this pilot study, we have attempted to measure and capture many of the elements of the racial wealth gap missing from the national data set that individuals and organizations at this convening have been discussing for years. So again, I want to emphasize the fact that this is a community building project from many individuals that aren't able to get credit, but have been very much a part of this study for a long time. Some highlights from this unprecedented study include a substantial variation in asset ownership patterns across all 4 cities, with Black and Mexican Americans typically occupying the bottom of the distribution. In Los Angeles, substantial variation in asset ownership amongst Asians, with Japanese and Chinese and Asian Indian Americans typically occupying higher levels of asset ownership, followed by Korean and Filipinos in more moderate positions, and with Vietnamese Americans grouped at the bottom with Mexicans and Black Americans in that city. In Miami, the asset ownership of Cuban Americans ranked higher than their Black and other Latino, such as Puerto Ricans, Central and South American Latinos in that city, but still ranked lower than the asset positions of whites in Miami. Tulsa, because of the relatively large share of Native Americans in the state of Oklahoma and its proximity to the Osage Nation reservation, allowed us to identify the asset holdings for a substantial sample of Native Americans. We find that the asset positions of Black, Mexican, and Native Americans are substantially lower than their white counterparts in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In Washington, D.C., we used a targeted sampling approach to identify asset ownership patterns of Chinese, Asian Indian, Korean, and Vietnamese Americans, groups comparable to the Asians we identified in Los Angeles, and find that there's less variation in asset ownership amongst Asians in D.C., and consistent with the other three cities, Blacks in D.C. are ranked amongst the lowest in terms of asset ownership. As I mentioned earlier, differences in intergenerational transfers is the primary cause of the racial wealth gap, where young adults have access to seed money to purchase some asset that appreciates over time. Access to this seed money is not based on some action on the part of the individual, but rather the familial position in which the individuals are born. Hence, a free market approach is inefficient, so a laissez-faire, do-nothing free market approach is insufficient to achieve a race-fair America that breaks the cruel links between race, inheritance, and economic advantage or disadvantage across generations. It was insufficient for whites and likewise would be insufficient for communities of colors. And this is well documented by Tom Shapiro and Melvin Oliver, as well as Ira Katz-Nelson. What is needed is a bold policy that ensures opportunity to build assets and economic security over a lifetime for everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, or the family in which the child is born. Policies in the vein of what John Powell has defined as targeted universalism. The baby bond program that William Darrick and I have advocated is a universal child trust program that progressively endows every newborn with an account at birth. The average account would be $20,000 and progressively rise to $60,000 for babies born into the most wealth-poor families. The accounts would grow at a federally guaranteed annual interest rate of 1.5% to 2%, which could be accessed when the child becomes an adult and used for some asset-enhancing endeavor, such as purchasing a home or starting a new business. With approximately 4 million babies born each year and the average account of $20,000 for every newborn, we estimate the cost of this program to be about $80 billion a year. In relative cost, this would only constitute about 2.2% of 2012 federal spending, which rivals what is spent by the Department of Education. Indeed, Tom Shapiro has pointed out that we can find this money simply by transforming the already asset-building budget that the federal government has and redistributing it in a more progressive manner so that the wealthiest amongst us don't get a third of that allocation and the bottom 60%, 5% of that allocation. If the federal program, the size of the Department of Education, could dramatically close the racial wealth gap and provide an opportunity for a lifetime of economic security for all Americans, I ask, wouldn't that be worth it? Thank you.